She called me her walking ATM and safety net boyfriend, while planning to use my airline miles for a secret trip with 3 other men. The discovery happened on what should have been just another quiet Tuesday evening in our downtown Portland apartment, the kind of peaceful night I'd grown to treasure after long days designing aerospace propulsion systems. I'm Lucas, 31 years old, and I work as an aerospace propulsion engineer for a major manufacturer, developing fuel efficiency systems for commercial aircraft. For the past 4 years, I'd been dating Natalie, a 28-year-old fitness instructor who taught yoga and personal training sessions at an upscale gym downtown. She'd always seemed to appreciate my career stability and the comfortable life my engineering salary provided, often mentioning how refreshing it was to date someone reliable after a string of relationships with flaky creative types and struggling musicians. That Tuesday evening changed everything when I noticed her tablet lighting up repeatedly with message notifications while she was taking her usual post-workout shower. The constant buzzing was coming from someone named Brett, and the preview showed something about finalizing cabin arrangements for their upcoming Lake Tahoe trip. I felt immediately confused because Natalie had spent the past month telling me she was planning a girls' weekend retreat with her college friends Sarah and Kelly, describing it as a chance to reconnect and decompress from work stress. My methodical engineering mind started processing the obvious disconnect between her story and what I was seeing on the screen. When I moved to place the tablet on the charger, the screen fully opened to reveal a group message thread titled, Tahoe Takeover, with weeks of detailed planning that made my blood run cold. The chat participants weren't just her female friends, there were 6 people total, including 3 men I'd never heard her mention: Brett, who appeared to be some kind of personal trainer from another gym, Marcus, and someone called DJ Mike. As I scrolled through the conversation history, I discovered Brett was not only organizing the trip but had specifically reserved a 2-bedroom cabin where he expected Natalie to stay in his room. The casual way they discussed sleeping arrangements and weekend activities made it clear this wasn't some innocent group outing. I felt my stomach drop as I read through weeks of messages where Natalie complained about me being suffocatingly predictable and obsessed with planning every detail of our future. She joked with the group about needing a break from playing house with Mr. Reliable and described our relationship dynamic in ways that made me feel like a stranger reading about someone else's life. The most devastating discovery was seeing how she'd volunteered to book everyone's flights using my accumulated airline miles. Miles I'd been carefully saving through work travel for a vacation we'd discussed taking together to celebrate our 4-year anniversary. She told the group that her personal bank account boyfriend wouldn't even notice the miles being used, and that I was so predictable I'd probably just assume she'd gotten a good deal somewhere. Reading her describe our relationship as her safety net while she figured out what she really wanted in life felt like discovering that everything I'd believed about us was built on a foundation of lies. I sat there in our shared living room, surrounded by furniture we'd picked out together and photos from trips we'd taken, realizing I was looking at evidence that the woman I loved viewed me as nothing more than financial security and emotional convenience. When I confronted Natalie about the lies the next morning, she didn't even attempt to deny what I'd discovered but instead turned the situation around to make me the villain for violating her privacy. I waited until she finished her morning coffee routine before placing her tablet on the kitchen counter and asking her to explain the Lake Tahoe group chat, keeping my voice calm and measured despite the betrayal burning in my chest. She glanced at the screen, and I watched her face shift from surprise to defiance in a matter of seconds, her jaw setting in that stubborn way I'd learned to recognize over our 4 years together. Instead of apologizing or showing any remorse, she launched into an attack about how I'd invaded her personal space and violated her trust by reading her messages, claiming that healthy relationships required boundaries and independence. I pointed out that discovering her lies wasn't the same as deliberately snooping, and that she'd been planning to steal my airline miles while lying to my face about a girls' weekend that was actually a mixed-gender getaway with sleeping arrangements already decided. She rolled her eyes and told me I was being dramatic, that it wasn't stealing because we'd been together long enough that my resources were essentially shared resources, and that I was proving her point about being controlling by making such a big deal about her having male friends. The conversation escalated when I asked her directly whether she planned to share Brett's room as the group chat suggested, And she responded by giving me an ultimatum that revealed exactly where I stood in her priorities. She told me I had two simple choices: either accept that she was going on this trip with her friends, regardless of their gender, or we could end our relationship right there if I couldn't handle dating someone who refused to be controlled. The casual way she presented this ultimatum, as if 4 years of building a life together could be discarded over a weekend trip with other men, showed me how little our relationship actually meant to her. She grabbed her gym bag and headed toward the door, pausing only to deliver one final insult about how if I couldn't trust her to have male friends without assuming the worst, maybe I should find someone more compatible with my boring lifestyle and need to control everything around me. I watched her leave for what I assumed was another training session, but the smug confidence in her voice told me she believed I'd cave to her demands rather than lose our relationship. She'd calculated that my stability-loving nature and 4-year investment in us would make me accept her terms rather than face the uncertainty of starting over, but she'd severely underestimated how much self-respect I actually possessed. As the apartment door closed behind her, I realized she'd just handed me the clarity I needed about exactly what kind of person I'd been sharing my life with, and more importantly, what kind of future I could expect if I stayed. After 2 hours of processing Natalie's ultimatum and the complete disrespect she'd shown for our relationship, I made the decision to contact her father Samuel, a 63-year-old retired Marine who'd transitioned into running his own construction company after his military service. Samuel had always treated me with the respect he'd give to another veteran, despite my lack of military background, and over 4 years he'd become something of a father figure since my own dad had passed away when I was in college. More importantly, Samuel was our landlord, having purchased the downtown Portland loft as an investment property and offering it to us at well below market rate as a way to help his daughter get established in her fitness career. I called him from my office during lunch break, and when he answered with his usual gruff warmth, I found myself explaining the entire situation with the methodical precision I'd normally reserve for technical reports. I told him about discovering the group chat, about Natalie's plans to use my airline miles for a trip with other men, and about her ultimatum that morning that revealed how little our 4-year relationship meant to her. Samuel listened without interruption, but I could hear his breathing change as I read him some of the messages where Natalie had mocked both him and me, calling him old-fashioned and clueless about modern relationships, and describing me as her personal bank account, who was too predictable to ever leave her. The silence that followed felt heavy, and when Samuel finally spoke, his voice carried the controlled anger I imagined he'd used when disciplining Marines under his command. He told me that his daughter had clearly forgotten the values about respect, honesty, and commitment that he'd tried to instill in her, and that her behavior was a disgrace to the family name he'd spent decades building through military service and honest business practices. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Samuel revealed that Natalie had been lying to her mother about the trip details as well, telling her parents it was a wellness retreat when she'd actually been bragging to her group chat about escaping her boring domestic life for a weekend. Samuel's military composure cracked completely when he learned that Natalie had been using his veterans' discount benefits to purchase expensive workout equipment and supplements, claiming the purchases were for her business when she'd actually been reselling items for personal profit. He told me with genuine pain in his voice that he'd raised his daughter to understand that integrity wasn't negotiable and that taking advantage of someone's generosity was the behavior of someone with no honor. As our conversation continued, I realized that Samuel was as disgusted with his daughter's actions as I was, and when he suggested we work together to teach Natalie about consequences, I found myself agreeing to an alliance I'd never expected to form. His final words before hanging up stayed with me for hours: that his daughter needed to learn that actions have permanent consequences, and that real men don't tolerate being treated like disposable resources by people who should know better. While Natalie was at her Thursday evening yoga class, Samuel and I executed what he called a strategic withdrawal operation, working with the precision and efficiency that his military background had taught him was essential for any successful mission. I'd texted Samuel when she left for the gym, and he arrived within 20 minutes driving his construction company truck, bringing along moving boxes, packing tape, and the systematic approach to logistics that had served him well during his Marine Corps deployment overseas. We started in the bedroom, where Samuel's expression grew grimmer as he surveyed the expensive wardrobe that my engineering salary had largely funded over the past 4 years, including designer workout clothes, shoes, and accessories that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief as we carefully folded and packed clothing I'd watched her choose during countless shopping trips, remembering how she'd always insisted that investing in quality pieces was important for her image as a fitness professional. Samuel insisted that expensive jewelry and electronics I'd purchased as gifts should remain with me, pointing out with military logic that gifts given in good faith during a relationship built on lies didn't need to be returned to someone who'd betrayed that trust. We discovered items I'd completely forgotten about: the tablet where I'd found her messages, a laptop I'd bought for her supposed fitness business that she'd barely used, and expensive supplements and equipment she'd purchased using his veteran discounts under false pretenses. The methodical process of packing 4 years of shared life into boxes felt surreal, like dismantling evidence of something that had never been as real as I'd believed, while Samuel provided running commentary about how his daughter had been raised better than to treat people with such casual disrespect. We moved through the apartment room by room, with Samuel taking photos to document everything we packed and creating an inventory list with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to military accountability standards. The living room revealed more evidence of the lifestyle my salary had supported: expensive candles, decorative items, and fitness equipment that had transformed our shared space into something that primarily reflected her preferences rather than any meaningful compromise between two partners. As we worked, Samuel shared stories about his daughter's childhood and the values he tried to instill, expressing genuine bewilderment about how someone he'd raised to understand integrity and respect could treat a committed relationship like a financial opportunity rather than an emotional partnership. The final step was drafting a simple note that we placed on the kitchen counter where she'd see it immediately upon returning from yoga class. You offered 2 choices. I selected option 3. Your father has your belongings. Samuel suggested the wording, explaining that clear communication without emotional drama was the most effective way to deliver important information, and that his daughter needed to understand that her actions had triggered consequences she hadn't anticipated when she'd confidently delivered her ultimatum that morning. As we loaded the last boxes into his truck, I realized that this systematic approach to ending things felt far more dignified than the emotional chaos Natalie had probably expected, and that working alongside someone who understood both commitment and consequences had given me exactly the support I'd needed to respond with strength rather than desperation. Despite discovering that her life had been systematically dismantled while she was at yoga class, Natalie proceeded with her Lake Tahoe trip the following weekend, apparently convinced that I'd eventually cave to her demands and welcome her back once she'd proven her independence by enjoying herself with other men. I learned about the spectacular disaster that followed through a mutual friend who worked at the gym with her, someone who received increasingly frantic text updates as Natalie's fantasy weekend transformed into a humiliating nightmare that cost her both money and dignity. The first catastrophe struck at Portland International Airport when she discovered that I'd canceled my airline miles account entirely, forcing her to purchase a last-minute ticket to Sacramento that cost nearly $800 on her already maxed-out credit card. She'd been so confident that I'd remain her financial safety net that she hadn't bothered to secure backup funding, leaving her scrambling to cover expenses she'd assumed would be handled through my accumulated travel benefits. Brett, the personal trainer she'd been flirting with through weeks of group chat messages, turned out to be everything I'd suspected: a shallow opportunist who'd invited her primarily because she'd volunteered to help cover cabin costs and bring what he assumed would be financial contributions from her well-paid boyfriend. When Natalie arrived at the rented lakeside cabin with only her portion of the expenses and no additional funding from me, Brett's interest in her diminished considerably, especially after he spotted an attractive resort employee who seemed more impressed by his muscles than frustrated by his lack of substance. The sleeping arrangements that had seemed so exciting in their group chat messages became a source of immediate humiliation when Brett announced that since everyone was splitting costs equally rather than having sponsors, people would need to find their own accommodations if they wanted privacy. Natalie ended up sleeping on the cabin's uncomfortable couch in the common area while Brett entertained his new resort acquaintance in the room she'd helped pay for, listening to sounds that made it clear exactly how replaceable she'd been in his vacation plans. Her friends Sarah and Kelly, who'd seemed so supportive in the group chat, were too busy with their own romantic dramas to offer much emotional support, leaving Natalie to navigate the social dynamics of a group where she'd lost her primary appeal once it became clear she wasn't bringing additional funding to enhance everyone's experience. The weekend she'd envisioned as proof of her desirability and independence instead became a series of expensive humiliations, overpriced resort meals she had to pay for herself, activities she couldn't afford without my engineering salary supporting her lifestyle, and the growing realization that her appeal to men like Brett was directly tied to her perceived access to financial resources rather than any genuine attraction to her personality. By Sunday morning, she was stranded at the cabin while her supposed friends extended their stay with romantic partners they'd met, forcing her to pay for solo transportation back to the airport and endure a lonely journey home that cost another $300 in ride-sharing fees and airport expenses. The trip that was supposed to prove she didn't need me had instead demonstrated exactly how dependent she'd become on my financial support and emotional stability, while revealing that her new social circle viewed her as disposable entertainment rather than a valued friend worthy of genuine care and respect. 2 months passed before Natalie made her desperate attempt to reconcile, months during which I'd thrown myself into work projects and started dating Isabella, a brilliant marine biologist who'd recently relocated to Portland for a research position studying Pacific Northwest coastal ecosystems. Isabella represented everything Natalie wasn't: financially independent, intellectually curious, and genuinely interested in building something meaningful with someone who shared her values about commitment and mutual respect. I was leaving my office building's parking structure on a Tuesday evening when Natalie appeared from behind a concrete pillar, looking dramatically different from the confident fitness instructor who'd delivered that ultimatum months earlier. Her appearance shocked me. She'd lost significant weight in an unhealthy way. Her usually perfect hair was unwashed and pulled back carelessly, and she was wearing clothes that looked like she'd been sleeping in them for days. Samuel had mentioned during our occasional check-ins that she'd been staying in budget motels around the city because he'd refused to let her return home without paying back the money she owed for misusing his veteran benefits, but seeing the physical evidence of her situation still caught me off guard. She started talking before I could even process her presence fully, launching into a rambling explanation about how the Lake Tahoe trip had been a terrible mistake and how she'd realized that everything she'd said during our confrontation had been the result of temporary insanity brought on by stress and confusion about her life direction. I listened with the same detached interest I'd give to a former colleague updating me about their career changes, noting how her desperation had stripped away the entitled confidence that had once defined her personality in favor of something that looked like genuine panic about her future prospects. She begged me to understand that her comments about me being her financial safety net had been taken out of context, claiming that she'd only been venting frustrations to friends who didn't understand our relationship dynamics, and that her real feelings had been distorted by the group chat format where people often said things they didn't truly mean. When I calmly explained that her words had revealed her authentic feelings about our relationship and that there was no foundation left for rebuilding anything meaningful between us, her desperation transformed into the kind of rage that emerges when manipulative tactics fail completely. She accused me of being vindictive and cruel for refusing to forgive someone who'd made an honest mistake, claiming that real love involved working through problems instead of abandoning people during their lowest moments, apparently forgetting that she'd been the one who'd delivered an ultimatum and walked away confidently expecting me to chase after her. The conversation reached its peak when she spotted Isabella's name on my phone screen as a dinner confirmation text came through, and the realization that I'd genuinely moved on with someone else triggered a final explosion of entitled fury where she called me pathetically boring and claimed that Brett had been right about me being too weak to handle a woman who knew her own worth. As I drove away, leaving her standing alone in the parking structure, I felt nothing but relief that I'd chosen option 3 instead of accepting either of her original ultimatums, and genuine gratitude that her betrayal had freed me to find someone who actually wanted to build a life with me rather than simply benefit from the one I'd already created. As I drove away from that final confrontation, I found myself responding to Natalie's insults with complete honesty about who I'd become since choosing option 3 instead of accepting her manipulative ultimatum months earlier. I told her through my rolled-down car window that she was absolutely right about me being boring by her standards, but that reliability, loyalty, and genuine care were actually attractive qualities to mature women who wanted real partnerships instead of financial arrangements disguised as relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me that Isabella had scheduled our dinner at the same restaurant where Natalie had always insisted we go for special occasions, except now I was meeting someone who insisted on splitting every check and who got genuinely excited about my engineering projects rather than viewing my career success as her personal funding source. Isabella's text about confirming our reservation represented everything Natalie had never understood about building an adult relationship, two independent people choosing to invest time and energy in each other because they actually enjoyed each other's company, not because one person provided financial security while the other contributed nothing but physical attraction and entitled demands. As I parked outside the restaurant, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed since that Tuesday evening when I discovered her tablet messages and realized that the woman I'd planned to marry had been mocking me behind my back while using my resources to fund adventures with other men. The promotion I'd received at work had come directly from my increased focus and productivity after removing the constant drain of Natalie's financial demands and emotional manipulation from my daily life, allowing me to channel my engineering skills into projects that actually mattered instead of constantly calculating how to afford her next expensive whim. Isabella greeted me at our table with genuine enthusiasm about a breakthrough in her research, and I found myself remembering what it felt like to date someone who had her own passions, her own goals, and her own bank account to fund her lifestyle choices. During dinner, Isabella mentioned that she'd been saving money to attend a marine biology conference in Vancouver, and when I offered to join her for a weekend exploring the city together, she immediately suggested we split all the travel costs because that's what equal partners do in healthy relationships. The contrast with Natalie's expectation that I fund her Lake Tahoe adventure with other men while she contributed nothing but complaints about my predictability was so stark it almost made me laugh out loud. 6 months later, Samuel called to tell me that Natalie had finally moved out of the Portland area entirely, apparently realizing that her reputation in the local fitness community had been permanently damaged by her pattern of using men for financial support before discarding them when better options appeared. He expressed genuine pride in how I'd handled the situation, noting that too many men would have accepted her ultimatum or taken her back after her desperate parking garage ambush, but that real strength meant walking away from people who treated love like a transaction rather than a commitment. As I hung up the phone in the home Isabella and I now shared, a place we'd chosen together and furnished with items we'd both contributed to purchasing, I realized that Natalie's betrayal had been the best thing that could have happened to my future happiness. Her decision to offer me those two unacceptable choices had led me to discover option 3, refusing to tolerate disrespect, building a life with someone who actually deserved my investment, and learning that sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is showing you exactly who they really are before you make the mistake of marrying them.